In the name of God, in this session we want to continue the discussion about competing motivation. Greenberg's generalization is one of the earliest examples of an important type of explanation of cross-linguistic variation, the concept of competing motivations. Competing motivations, as I told you, are the most important term in typology. But what we mean by competing motivation? Competing motivations models describe the interaction of universal typological principles or motivations in order to account for the existence of variation in language types. This is the definition of competing motivation. Competing motivations models describe the interaction of universal typological principles. There is a challenge between the principle, and one of that challenge will be when to be exist in that language or motivations in order to account for the existence of variation in language types. This is the definition of competing motivation. Maybe I gave you this definition and I give you different definition for competing motivation, and you should choose the best one. You should know the definition of competing motivation. The motivations are generally functionally based in typological analysis, but the competing motivations model doesn't require the motivations to be functional. Competing motivations such as dominance and harmony. Dear student, dominance and harmony, which we discussed in previous sessions, both of them are competing motivation. Okay? The competing motivations such as dominance and harmony are not strictly functional, although functional explanations have been offered for them. In a competing motivations model, no one language type is ideal. It means that wholly motivated, because the different principles governing the existence of language types are in conflict, are in competition. This is important. I want to repeat it again. In a competing motivations model, no one language type is ideal. It means that wholly motivated, because the different principles governing the existence of language types are in conflict, are in competition with each other. In Greenberg's word order analysis, some word orders such as noun adjective are motivated by dominance, while either noun adjective or adjective noun order is motivated by harmony in terms of its alignment with the order of other modifiers. We told you that dominance and harmony are competing motivation, and one of them will be written in one language. Since for some modifiers, modifier noun order is dominant, and for others, noun modifier order is dominant, a language cannot be harmonic without having some recessive orders. We told you about this term. However, an order is predicted not to be both recessive and disharmonic at the same time. Dear student, in the tetrachoric table, which we discussed in the previous sessions, we had the recessive and disharmonic at the same time in that tetrachoric, which we showed that with the minus symbol. When we had the minus symbol, it means that or a type, or for example a word order or a concept was both recessive and both disharmonic, we told you that that language doesn't exist. We don't have such a language. Therefore, based on the competing motivation, one term cannot be both recessive and disharmonic, because when a concept is both recessive and disharmonic, that does not exist. The value in competing motivation models for typology is that they can account for both variation in language types and also frequency of language types across the world. Thus, competing motivations provide an important class of explanations for both typological variation and constraints on that variation. However, it should not be thought that in, say, an noun-adjective language only dominance is part of its grammar of modifiers, and in an adjective language only harmony is part of its grammar of modifiers. The motivations are ultimately functional in a region and are present for all speakers of all languages. Competing motivations influence the conventions of a grammar of a particular language and can alter the conventions in the process of language change. But they are not part of the conventions of a particular language at a particular time pursued. All speakers have all motivations as part of their social and cognitive context. Okay, all speakers have all motivations as part of their social and cognitive context. Competing motivation analysis can exclude certain logically possible types and therefore are not necessarily vacuous. In Greenberg's analysis of word order, one logically possible type is excluded, dear student. Competing motivation analysis can exclude certain logically possible types, sometimes are excluded in competing motivation, and therefore are not necessarily vacuous. In Greenberg's analysis of word order, one logically possible type is excluded, the type in which the two word orders are disharmonic and both recessive, as I told you. Therefore, this type, which is both disharmonic and recessive, it doesn't exist. This type is, of course, the one type excluded by the implicational statement of the word order pattern, because we know that we don't have such a terms and such a word order which is both recessive and both disharmonic. That not exist. In general, we may characterize a non-vacuous competing motivation model as one in which you should know this for principle, dear student. In general, we may characterize a non-vacuous competing motivation model as one in which satisfaction of all motivations simultaneously is logically impossible. This is the first non-vacuous competing motivation model. Therefore, satisfaction of all motivations simultaneously is logically impossible. Some allowed logically possible type, that the second one is that some allowed logically possible types can be attributed to satisfaction of one motivation. Some allowed logically possible types can be attributed to satisfaction of one motivation. Number 3, the other allowed logically possible types can be attributed to satisfaction of another motivation. These four principles are important. The prohibited logically possible types represent the satisfaction of no motivation. This is important. You should know all of them. It means that it is not possible to satisfy all of the motivation, all of the competing motivation. We cannot satisfy both of the principle. And some allowed logically possible types can be attributed to satisfaction of one motivation. The other allowed logically possible types can be attributed to satisfaction of another motivation. The prohibited logically possible types represent the satisfaction of no motivation. At this point, the value for typology of non-vacuous competing motivation analysis should be clear. Okay. They allow for universal characterization of typological variation. All languages, and therefore all human beings, have both underlying motivations attributed to them. A particular language at a particular historical stage has conventionally resolved the competing motivation in one of the several possible acceptable ways. Moreover, languages can change over time, reflecting a reassertion of one motivation at the expense of the other. Nevertheless, certain possible types are excluded, or at least assumed to be very rare by virtue of satisfying no motivation. Condition 1, which we discussed, that was it is not possible to the satisfaction of all of the motivation is not possible, may be too strong for a specific subset of competing motivation. For example, noun-relative order appears to be dominant and verb-object order may be dominant. I mean, both of them may be dominant. Noun-relative order be dominant and verb-object order may be dominant. If so, it means that if both of the noun-relative and verb-object order both of them be dominant, it means that both of them be satisfied. If so, then verb-object and noun-relative languages satisfy both dominance and harmonic simultaneously. It means that they violate the condition 1. We told you that it is not possible to satisfy all of the motivation. If all motivations are satisfied, why do object verb and noun relative and object verb and relative noun languages exist? Presumably, it is because we have examined only a subset of the competing motivations involved, and other competing motivation may not be satisfied in verb, object, and noun relative languages. Okay, it is because we have examined only a subset of the competing motivation involved, and other the competing motivation may not be satisfied in verb, object, and noun relative languages. As I told you, it is not possible to satisfy all of the motivation. It means that here we just consider these two motivation. Maybe they said these two word order didn't satisfy other motivation because we just don't have such two motivation. Therefore, it is correct because they maybe violate other competing motivation. In a vacuous competing motivation analysis, condition 4, which we told you above, doesn't apply. Hence, every logically possible type is allowed. In other words, one could reach the same explanatory goal simply by stating that every logically possible type is actually possible. Most linguists would select the latter explanation over a vacuous competing motivation analysis because the latter is simpler. However, the latter explanation, anything goes, is really a non-explanation. Typologists generally take two approaches to vacuous competing motivation models. The first is to refine a vacuous competing motivation analysis so that some logically possible language type is indeed excluded by the analysis and is indeed empirically unattested. The second is to make quantitative predictions instead of qualitative ones. The fact that a competing motivation analysis doesn't exclude any possible types doesn't mean that the analysis is invalid if it can predict relative frequencies of the language types. Then it is a genuine explanation. We illustrate both strategies here. A number of linguists have proposed a set of universal pragmatic principles motivating word order. Okay. A number of linguists have proposed a set of universal pragmatic principles motivating word order. These principles have a long history in functionalism. The three most important ones are listed here, as formulated by Hyman. Okay, these principles are the universal principle, pragmatic universal principle. Number one, what is old information comes first. What is new information comes later in an utterance. Number two, ideas that are closely connected tend to be placed together. Number three, what is at the moment uppermost in the speaker's mind? It means that less predictable, more important, more intended to be attended to by the hearer, tends to be first expressed. Okay, we have these three universal and pragmatic. Now we want to describe them. Most critical attention has been focused on principle 1 versus 3, that old information comes first, then the new one. New information is generally what is at the moment uppermost in the speaker's mind, and all information is not. By principle 1, new information should follow old information. By principle 3, new information should precede old information. It means that the number 3 is against the number 1. Principle 1 and 3 appear to provide a classic vacuous competing motivation for the ordering of old and new information in utterance. It means that based on the first principle, we say that the old information must comes first, but based on the third principle, the new information should come first. Therefore, we have they are in conflict with each other, and we have the competition between these two principles. A more refined definition of old versus new and of being uppermost in the speaker's mind may allow us to separate these motivations and construct a proper non-vacuous competing motivation analysis. But Hyman notes that principle 3 is in conflict with principle 2 as well. Fronting of uppermost information often split up otherwise conceptually close constituents. Thus, principle 2 will tend to place certain constituents together, and principle 3 will tend to separate them. Other things being equal. This is again a classic case of vacuous competing motivation, since no possibility is excluded. Okay, the third one is in conflict with the third one too. Hyman's argument against vacuity is applied to one word order phenomenon. The position of the questioned element in information question and of the often identical relative pronoun is in relative clauses, so-called WH movement. Hyman identifies principal tree with linguistic focus, which is most likely to be uppermost in the speaker mind. It means that the new information comes first. He argues that principal tree, which based on that the new information should come first, apply to information questions only. The question element is in focus and will therefore be found in the focus position. If focus is indicated by a special position, Hyman predicts that relative pronouns will behave differently from interrogative pronouns, even though they are usually analyzed to be the same kind of syntactic element as interrogative pronouns. Principal tree doesn't apply since they are not in focus, and apparently principal one doesn't apply either. Instead, principal two applies. They are attracted to the head noun of the relative clause. In other words, for information questions, focusing generally governed by principal tree overrides conceptual closeness, while for relative pronouns, focusing doesn't apply, and so principle 2 is free to apply. Typologically, this means that language types in which the relative pronouns is not positioned next to the head noun should not exist. Even if the question word allegedly the same constituent type is moved to a focus position. Hyman's conjecture is confirmed by his typological survey, with one exception. The crucial test cases are those languages in which focus elements are not fronted. An example of this language type is Hungarian, in which relative pronouns consist of the definite article a combined with the interrogative pronoun. In Hungarian, focus elements are placed immediately before the verb. Relative pronouns are moved next to the head noun, which precedes the relative clause. The crucial examples are those in which the question word is not initial, thus demonstrating that it is in preverbal, not sentence initial position. Here you can see its example, that the relative clause precedes the verb. And those in which the relative pronoun is separated from the verb, thus demonstrating that the relative pronoun position is a sentence initial, not preverbal, like here. Hyman has demonstrated that principles 2 and 3 exist and operate independently in the ways that a competing motivation analysis would predict. The second approach to competing motivation analysis can be illustrated for generalizations over affix order within words. It has long been noted that there is an overall cross-linguistic frequency preference for suffixes. This evidence suggests that the morpheme order root suffix is dominant. Hawkins and Gilligan also provide evidence supporting the implicational universal if object verb postposition, then root suffix, and conversely if prefix root, then verb object and preposition. This implicational universal supports the dominance of root suffix over prefix root order. It also suggests that object verb is harmonic with suffixing and that prefixing is harmonic with verb object. Thus we have a typical dominance, harmonic competing motivation analysis. Hawkins and Gilligan support the implicational universal by examining specific affix types, such as gender, suffixes, and nouns. In this case, they extrapolated the following proportional distribution of gender affixes. Here we have word order type, which is verb, object, or prepositional. Gender prefix is 20% and gender suffixes is 3%. And object verb or postpositional, which is 0% and 50%. This distribution would arise if there is approximately equal balance between root suffix dominance and affix word order harmony. In object verb languages, dominance and harmony motivate exclusive suffixing. In verb object languages, dominance and harmony compete, motivating an approximately equal division between prefixing and suffixing. Hawkins and Gilligan proposed that the overall suffixing preference is simply a sum of individual suffixing preferences. There is no general suffixing preference. However, while the pattern given above for gender is found also with affixes, encoding indefiniteness. Definiteness, plural, tense, aspect, modality, and causative. The pattern for case is different. Case affixes are almost exclusively suffixes, no matter what the word order is. This fact can be analyzed in two ways. The first analysis is that case has a much stronger motivation for suffixing. The second analysis is that there is an overall suffixing preference for all affixes, which account for gender and etc., but that case has an additional suffixing motivation. Also, Hawkins and Gilligan observed that 5 types of affix are found as both prefixes and suffixes in both verb-object and object-verb languages. Person indexation for subject, object, and possessor, negative affixes, and more equivocally voice affixes. However, another possibility is that these affixes have individual motivations that compete with word order harmony and possibly with a general suffixing dominance. The proportion for the indexation patterns and for negation from one cross-linguistic sample are given below, like here. Here you can see negation in 123 genera or language, possessor indexation in 186 genera, in which here in negation we have the language which is verb object. Those which have used the prefix for negation are 17%, and those use suffix are 7%. And those who are object verb, they use 21% use the prefix and 55% use suffix. And here, those languages who use the prefix for possessor indexation in verb object are use the prefix 19%, and those use the suffix as are 25%. And those languages which are object verb and use the possessor, the prefix for possessor indexation are 35%, and those who use suffix are 21%. And even for subject indexation, by considering 227 languages, those languages which were verb object, they use 26% of them use prefix for subject indexation, and 15 of them use the suffix for subject indexation. And for object verb languages, 19% of them use prefix for subject indexation, and 40 of them use the suffix for subject indexation. And by considering 131 languages, For object indexation, the languages which were verb object use 10% for 10% of them use prefix for object indexation, and 32% use the suffix for object indexation. And those languages which were object verb use 32% use the object in the prefix for object indexation, and 26% use the suffix for object indexation. There seems to be motivation for person and negative affixes to be prefixes, despite the harmony of object verb with suffixation found with other affix types. On the other hand, one would then expect a higher proportion of prefixes than suffixes in verb object languages, and that is clearly found only with negation. Subject and possessor indexation are approximately equal. Object indexation seems to have an anti-harmonic pattern, more prefixes in object-verb languages and more suffixes with verb-object languages. In this model, then there are three competing motivations. Please consider to these three competing motivations. Number one, an overall suffixing preference, harmony of verb-object and preposition with prefixing, and object-verb post-position with suffixing. Individual preferences for particular inflectional categories, suffixing for case, prefixing for negative, and subject and possessor indexation. The lesson to be drawn from the competing motivation analysis of affix order is that a more fine-grained approach to typological classification, here differentiating affix types, will reveal significant universals as well as more complex pattern of cross-linguistic distribution in some cases. The more complex interaction in a competing motivation analysis will require more sophisticated quantitative techniques. However, competing motivation analysis provides a theoretical framework in which to convert statistical distribution into underlying motivation factors. In sum, competing motivations analysis offer an explanation for language variation. This is important, dear student. Here we summarize all of the things which we told you. In sum, competing motivations analysis offer an explanation for language variation. There are multiple motivations for language types, like those which we told you, like the harmony, dominant, and the word order of languages like object verb and verb object. All of them are competing motivation. This motivation compete with one another, such that no single language type satisfies all competing motivations simultaneously. All language types that are partially motivated may exist. Hence, variation in language type is found. Moreover, the proportion of attested language types reflect the number and or degree of motivation of each language type. Dear student, this is very, very important. This summarization, it's give you information about what we told you. Please write this summarization in your summarization task, and this is the principle of competing motivation. Please look at this session, and in this summarization all of the matters which we told you in details, all of them are exist in this paragraph. Look at this, and if you had any problem, please ask me in WhatsApp. Do its task and the definition of competing motivation and its principle, which I told you in this session. All of them are important for your final exam. Maybe I ask you the definition of motivation, this principle, you should know all of that principle, or competitive motivation in pragmatic and in word order. Please do a test and ask your question. Thank you. In the name of God,